In 1761, a 7-year-old African girl named Phillis Wheatley was stolen from her home and sold into slavery in Boston. No one expected her to survive, let alone change the course of history. Against unimaginable odds, she learned to read and write in a world determined to keep her silent. By her teens, her poetry was so powerful that even George Washington praised her work. Her words challenged the very foundations of a society built on oppression, proving that talent and courage could never be chained. This is the story of a child who refused to be erased, and whose voice still echoes through history today. If you're ready to uncover more incredible stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment below so you don't miss any of our history videos. In the verdant landscape of what historians believe to be present-day Senegal, or the Gambia, a child was born. Her original name has been lost to history, one of countless erasures inflicted by the transatlantic slave trade. What is known is that she belonged to the Fulani people, a detail she would later recall through fragments of memory. Her mother pouring out water before the sun each morning, a ritual of spiritual devotion that would stay with her across an ocean and a lifetime. According to Phillis Wheatley's own accounts and early biographical sources, she was approximately 7 or 8 years old when captured. The detail about her mother's morning ritual appears in early biographical sketches, including those by Margaretta Matilda Odell, 1834, who had access to family records and oral histories from the Wheatley household, that if stories like this matter to you, stay with me, because what she did next changed history in ways they never expected. The year was approximately 1761 when the child's world shattered. Slavers, likely working in coordination with coastal traders, tore her from everything she knew. The mechanisms of this violence were well established by then: kidnapping, warfare, betrayal, all feeding the insatiable appetite of a trade that had already consumed millions of African lives. She was forced aboard a vessel bound for the Americas. The ship bore the name Phillis. The Middle Passage. Even the name sanitizes its horror. Historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forced across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries. Nearly 2 million died during the voyage itself, their bodies discarded into waters that became graveyards. The journey took approximately 6 to 8 weeks, though the exact duration of this particular voyage remains undocumented. What is documented, however, is the systematic brutality of such crossings. Humans packed into spaces so confined they could barely move, disease spreading rapidly through the fetid darkness, the constant threat of death hovering over every chained body. The child who would become Phillis Wheatley survived. But survival came at an unfathomable cost. She arrived in Boston Harbor in July 1761, weakened by the voyage, suffering from a chronic asthma condition that would plague her throughout her life, a condition likely exacerbated or caused by the conditions of her captivity. The arrival date of July 1761 is documented in Boston port records and confirmed by multiple contemporary sources, including advertisements and the Wheatley family's own accounts. Her poor health upon arrival is noted in several early biographies, with her chronic asthma mentioned throughout her life in correspondence. She stood on the auction block barely clothed, wrapped only in a piece of dirty carpet to cover her nakedness. This detail preserved in historical accounts and speaks volumes about the degradation inherent in the institution of slavery. A child traumatized, ill, stripped of dignity, offered for sale like livestock. John Wheatley, a prosperous tailor and merchant, sought a domestic servant for his wife, Susanna. He was not looking for exceptional intelligence or hidden genius. He wanted, as the historical record suggests, someone young enough to be trained, compliant enough to serve. What he got was something neither he nor America was prepared for. The girl was purchased and brought to the Wheatley home at King Street in Boston's affluent North End. She was given the name of the ship that had carried her into bondage, Phillis, and the surname of her enslavers, Wheatley. The name Phillis Wheatley was not chosen by her. It was assigned, a label of ownership masquerading as identity. Names carry power. They anchor us to family, to culture, to history. The transatlantic slave trade specialized in severing these anchors. When a person's name is taken, a fundamental part of their humanity is stolen. When that person is then named after the instrument of their captivity, the violence compounds. The Wheatley household was unusual, though calling it progressive would be a dangerous overstatement. John and Susanna Wheatley had 2 surviving children, a daughter, Mary, who was 18 years old, and a son, Nathaniel, who was in his early 20s. The family was reasonably wealthy, educated, and connected to Boston's merchant elite. What happened next has been romanticized by some historians and properly scrutinized by others. The Wheatleys, particularly Susanna and Mary, noticed something about young Phillis. The child learned English with remarkable speed. Within 16 months of her arrival, by her own account and that of her enslavers, she could read the Bible fluently. The 16-month time frame for Phillis's mastery of English is documented in the attestation published in her 1773 poetry collection and in contemporary letters from the Wheatley family. This extraordinary linguistic acquisition is verified by multiple independent sources. But this was not merely language acquisition. Phillis demonstrated an appetite for learning that startled the household. She studied Latin, learning to read classical texts in their original language. She absorbed the works of Alexander Pope, whose heroic couplets would influence her own poetic style. She read John Milton, Virgil, Ovid, and Horace. She studied theology, history, geography, and astronomy. The Wheatleys made a decision that was both remarkable and revealing of their own limitations. They reduced Phillis's domestic duties and encouraged her studies. They gave her candles so she could read and write at night. They allowed her access to their library and brought her books. This has often been portrayed as kindness. But it's essential to understand what it actually was, an experiment. The Wheatleys were testing a hypothesis that went against everything their society believed about black intelligence. They were curious. They were surprised. But they never, despite all the education and encouragement, freed her. Encouragement without liberation is not benevolence. It is curiosity. The Wheatleys' treatment of Phillis reveals the contradictions of colonial American thought. They could recognize genius, cultivate it, benefit from it, and still maintain that the person possessing it was property. By age 13, Phillis Wheatley was writing poetry. Not simple verses or crude imitations, but sophisticated, technically accomplished poetry that demonstrated mastery of neoclassical form, biblical allusion, and complex theological argumentation. Her first known poem, written in 1765, marked the beginning of an extraordinary literary output. By 1767, she had composed On Being Brought from Africa to America, a poem that would become one of her most analyzed works. The poem's 8 lines contain layers of meaning that scholars continue to debate. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand, that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and joined to angelic train." On Being Brought from Africa to America was written circa 1767 and published in her 1773 collection. The poem's date of composition is established through multiple contemporary sources and the publication history documented in Boston newspapers and the collection itself. On the surface, the poem appears to embrace the Christian framework that justified her enslavement, the notion that slavery, however brutal, was worthwhile because it brought Africans to Christianity. But a closer reading reveals something more subversive. The final couplet directly confronts Christian hypocrisy, reminding white Christian readers that their own theology demanded they recognize black humanity and spiritual equality. Phillis was not simply parroting Christian doctrine. She was wielding it as a weapon, using the colonizers' own religious framework to indict their racism. Her poetry gained attention. In 1770, she wrote an elegy on the death of George Whitefield, the famous evangelical preacher. The poem was published as a broadside in Boston and later reprinted in newspapers throughout the colonies and in London. It was her first widely distributed work, and it brought her both fame and skepticism. Fame, for a black girl enslaved in colonial America, was a double-edged sword. Recognition brought opportunity, but it also intensified scrutiny. Every word she wrote, every thought she expressed, was examined not just for its artistic merit, but as evidence in an ongoing trial, the trial of black humanity itself. The questions started immediately. How could an African write such poetry? Surely someone was helping her, writing for her, or at minimum, heavily editing her work. The assumption was automatic. Exceptional black achievement must be fraudulent. Phillis Wheatley, at age 17, found herself in a position that countless black intellectuals, artists, and innovators would face in the centuries to come. She had to prove that her mind was her own. The examination took place in October 1772. Phillis Wheatley, now approximately 19 years old, was summoned to appear before 18 of Boston's most prominent white men. The composition of this panel is itself telling. documented in the attestation they would later sign. His Excellency Thomas Hutchinson, Governor. The Honorable Andrew Oliver, Lieutenant Governor. The Honorable Thomas Hubbard, John Irving, James Pitts, Harrison Gray, James Bowden, and Joseph Green, Esquires, members of His Majesty's Council. The Reverend Charles Chauncey, D.D. The Reverend Mather Biles, D.D. The Reverend Ed Pemberton, D.D. The Reverend Andrew Elliott, D.D. The Reverend Samuel Cooper, D.D. The Reverend Mr. Samuel Mather, John Hancock, Esquire, the Honorable Isaac Royal, and the Honorable Martin Howard, Esquires. The complete list of examiners and their attestation was published in the front matter of Wheatley's 1773 poems on various subjects, religious and moral. The document is preserved in multiple original copies of the publication, held in libraries, including the Library of Congress and the Boston Public Library. These were not literary critics gathering for a collegial discussion of poetry. This was the colonial power structure assembled to investigate a threat, the threat that a black mind might be equal to their own. The details of the examination are not fully recorded, but the nature of such interrogations can be reconstructed from contemporary accounts of similar proceedings and from the attestation itself. Phillis would have been questioned about classical literature, asked to recite and translate Latin passages, interrogated about her knowledge of the Bible, and challenged to demonstrate that she understood the complex theological and philosophical concepts present in her poetry. Imagine the scene: a young black woman, legally classified as property, standing before the colony's governor, lieutenant governor, prominent ministers, and wealthy merchants. She had no legal rights. She could not vote, own property, or even claim ownership of her own body. And yet, she was being asked to prove the legitimacy of her intellect to men who benefited from denying it. This was not an examination. It was a trial, and the stakes were larger than one person's reputation. Phillis Wheatley's intelligence challenged the entire ideological foundation of slavery. If she could think, imagine, and create at this level, what did that say about the millions of other Africans held in bondage? What did it say about the institution itself? She passed. The men signed a document attesting to the authenticity of her work. We whose names are underwritten do assure the world that the poems specified in the following page were, as we verily believe, written by Phillis, a young Negro girl, who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa, and has ever since been, and now is, under the disadvantage of serving as a slave in a family in this town. She has been examined by some of the best judges, and is thought qualified to write them. The attestation text quoted here is reproduced verbatim from the original publication. The language itself reveals the examiner's prejudices even as they confirmed her authorship. Note the phrases uncultivated barbarian and under the disadvantage of serving as a slave, which simultaneously acknowledge her achievement while maintaining racist assumptions. The language of this attestation deserves examination. Even in confirming her genius, these men could not resist asserting their superiority. She was an uncultivated barbarian before they, civilization itself, discovered her. The document manages to be both validation and insult, recognition and dismissal. But it served its purpose. With this attestation, Phillis Wheatley had documented proof that white authority recognized her authorship. It was absurd that such proof was necessary. It was degrading that she had to submit to such examination. And yet, it was also strategic. She understood the world she lived in, and she played the hand she was dealt with remarkable skill. Despite the attestation, no American publisher would take the risk of publishing a book by an enslaved black woman. The manuscript, titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was rejected in Boston and throughout the colonies. Susanna Wheatley, to her credit, was determined to see Phillis's work published. Through connections with Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, arrangements were made for publication in London. In 1773, Phillis traveled to England accompanied by Nathaniel Wheatley, ostensibly for health reasons, but also to oversee the publication. The London publication of Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral by Archibald Bell in 1773 is thoroughly documented. Original copies exist in numerous institutions worldwide. The voyage to London and Phillis's reception there are recorded in contemporary letters and newspaper accounts from both London and Boston. London received her differently than Boston had. She met with nobility, including the Countess of Huntingdon and the Earl of Dartmouth. She was presented with a copy of John Milton's Paradise Lost as a gift. Benjamin Franklin, then in London, came to meet her. She was treated, for perhaps the first time in her life, as something approaching an equal, at least in certain circles. But there's a bitter irony here. Phillis Wheatley was celebrated in London's drawing rooms while remaining legally enslaved. She was an intellectual curiosity, praised for her exceptional nature, which implicitly reinforced the notion that other enslaved Africans lacked her abilities. Her individual genius was weaponized to become an exception that proved the rule. The politics of exceptionalism is insidious. When society elevates one member of an oppressed group as extraordinarily talented, it creates a false binary: the exceptional individual versus the supposedly ordinary masses. This allows the oppression to continue because it reframes the problem as one of individual merit rather than systemic injustice. Phillis Wheatley's London visit was cut short. Word came that Susanna Wheatley was seriously ill, and Phillis returned to Boston before her book was officially released. She would never return to London, never see many of the admirers she had made, never experience again that peculiar form of conditional acceptance she had found there. The book was published in September 1773. It contained 39 poems, covering subjects from religion and morality to elegies for prominent figures, reflections on imagination and memory, and veiled commentaries on freedom and slavery. The collection demonstrated technical mastery of the neoclassical style, sophisticated use of biblical and classical allusion, and a complex negotiation of her position as both an educated poet and an enslaved African. One poem, To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth, contains perhaps her most direct statement on slavery and freedom. Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway. To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth, appears in the original 1773 collection. The quoted passage directly references her kidnapping from Africa and her parents' suffering, providing rare autobiographical detail in her published work. Here briefly the mask slips. The carefully constructed neoclassical elegance gives way to raw emotion. She speaks of being snatched, of pangs excruciating, of a father robbed of his child. She calls the perpetrator's soul steeled, and by no misery moved. This is not subtle. This is indictment. Phillis Wheatley was freed shortly after her return from London, sometime in October 1773. The exact date is not recorded, itself a telling detail. For an event supposedly so momentous, the liberation of America's first published black poet, there is no ceremony, no documentation, no formal record preserved. Why was she freed then? The reasons are unclear and likely multiple. Susanna Wheatley was dying, and perhaps wanted this act completed before her death. The book's publication had made Phillis famous, and continuing to hold a celebrated poet in bondage may have seemed increasingly untenable to the Wheatleys. There may have been pressure from London contacts, or perhaps it was simply convenient timing. The approximate date of Phillis's manumission is inferred from letters and later biographical accounts, though no formal manumission document has been found in Boston records. Susanna Wheatley's death in March 1774 is documented, as is Phillis's continued residence in the Wheatley household after gaining her freedom. But freedom, in revolutionary Boston, was a complicated concept. Phillis was legally free, but she had no independent income, no property, no family beyond the Wheatleys, and no safety net. She remained in the Wheatley household, still dependent on the family that had once owned her. Susanna Wheatley died in March 1774. With her death, Phillis lost her primary advocate within the household. John Wheatley died in 1778. Mary had married and moved to England. Nathaniel was often traveling. Phillis, though legally free, was increasingly alone and economically vulnerable. The American Revolution complicated everything. Boston became a battleground of ideas and armies. Phillis wrote poems celebrating the revolutionary cause, including a famous poem addressed to George Washington in 1775. Washington was so impressed that he invited her to visit him at his headquarters in Cambridge in March 1776. The poem, To His Excellency General Washington, was written in October 1775 and sent to Washington. His reply, dated February 28, 1776, thanking her and inviting her to visit, is preserved in the Washington Papers at the Library of Congress. Multiple accounts confirm that she visited him in Cambridge, though the exact date is debated by historians. Think about that moment. An African woman, formerly enslaved, visiting the man who would become the nation's first president. She praised his cause, liberty and freedom from tyranny. Washington, who enslaved over 100 people at Mount Vernon, received this praise graciously. The contradiction was not lost on Phillis Wheatley. In a letter written in 1774, she articulated the hypocrisy with devastating clarity. In every human breast, God has implanted a principle, which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. This quote is from a letter Phillis Wheatley wrote to Reverend Samson Occam, a Mohegan preacher, dated February 11, 1774. The letter was published in multiple New England newspapers and is preserved in historical records. Our modern Egyptians, a withering reference to white American slaveholders who claimed to fight for liberty while denying it to others. She saw the hypocrisy. She named it, and yet she remained trapped by it. On April 1, 1778, Phillis Wheatley married John Peters, a free black man. Peters is a controversial figure in Wheatley scholarship, often portrayed as either a charming scoundrel who brought her to ruin or an ambitious man struggling against impossible odds in a society that denied black men economic opportunity. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Peters was literate, articulate, and attempted various business ventures. Some contemporary accounts describe him as well-dressed and perhaps overly proud. But the context matters. A free black man in revolutionary and post-revolutionary Boston faced extraordinary barriers to economic success. The marriage date of April 1, 1778, is documented in Boston records. Information about John Peters comes from scattered contemporary accounts, legal records related to debt, and later biographical sources. The characterizations of Peters vary widely depending on the source and its racial perspective. Phillis attempted to publish a second volume of poetry. She advertised for subscribers in 1779, proposing a collection of 33 poems and 13 letters. The subscription effort failed. Not enough people committed to purchasing the book. The manuscript, which included some of her most mature work, was never published and is now lost to history. This failure is significant. When Phillis Wheatley was a curiosity, an enslaved African girl writing poetry, she found patrons and publishers. When she was a free black woman attempting to sustain a literary career, the support evaporated. The novelty had worn off. The political usefulness had diminished. She was no longer exceptional. She was simply black, female, and poor. Recognition is not the same as support. Celebration is not the same as justice. Phillis Wheatley learned what many black artists and intellectuals would learn after her, that being acknowledged as talented does not guarantee being valued as human. She had 3 children with John Peters. All 3 died in infancy or early childhood. The loss of children to disease and poverty was common in 18th century Boston, but it was disproportionately devastating for black families who lacked access to adequate health care, nutrition, and stable housing. Peters struggled with debt and was imprisoned for it at least once. Phillis took work as a servant, the very work she had done as a child enslaved, now performed as a free woman to survive. The poet who had been received by the Countess of Huntingdon and General Washington was scrubbing floors. She continued to write. A few poems were published in newspapers and magazines under her name. But the volume of her output declined, not because her genius had faded, but because genius cannot flourish when every day is consumed with survival. Phillis Wheatley Peters died on December 5, 1784. She was approximately 31 years old. The location was a boarding house in a poor section of Boston. She died in obscurity and poverty, attended by few if any who recognized her significance. Her last surviving child, an infant, died within hours of her own death. They were buried together in an unmarked grave. The location of that grave is unknown. The woman who had been examined by governors and received by countesses disappeared into the earth without ceremony or stone to mark the spot. Phillis Wheatley's death on December 5, 1784, is documented in Boston death records. The circumstances of her death, poverty, the death of her child, the unmarked grave, are attested to in contemporary accounts and obituary notices, including one in the Boston Independent Chronicle dated December 9, 1784. The Independent Chronicle published a brief notice. Last Lord's Day, died Mrs. Phyllis Peters, formerly Phillis Wheatley, aged 31, known to the world by her celebrated miscellaneous poems. Her funeral is to be this afternoon, at 4 o'clock, from the house lately improved by Mr. Todd, nearly opposite Dr. Bulfinch's at West Boston, where her friends and acquaintances are desired to attend. Friends and acquaintances. Not family, for she had none living. Not patrons, for they had long since lost interest. Just friends and acquaintances, if any came at all. This is how America treated its first published black poet. This is what happened to genius when it wore black skin and had no wealth to sustain it. Phillis Wheatley's death was both tragedy and indictment, an indictment of a society that could recognize brilliance, but could not bear to support it. For decades after her death, Phillis Wheatley was largely forgotten. Her 1773 collection was occasionally reprinted, but often with editorial commentary that patronized or dismissed her achievement. When she was remembered at all, it was often as an oddity, an exception, a curiosity rather than a serious literary figure. But something remarkable happened over time. Phillis Wheatley's work survived. Her words, carefully preserved in her 1773 collection and scattered publications, outlasted the people who doubted her. The poems that were scrutinized as potential frauds became foundational texts in African American literature. In the 19th century, abolitionists recognized Phillis Wheatley's strategic importance. Her very existence disproved the claims of black intellectual inferiority that undergirded slavery. Frederick Douglass referenced her. William Wells Brown included her in his pioneering works on black achievement. She became evidence in the ongoing argument for black humanity. References to Phillis Wheatley appear in numerous 19th-century abolitionist texts, including Frederick Douglass's speeches and writings, William Wells Brown's The Black Man, his antecedents, his genius, and his achievements, 1863, and other anti-slavery literature documenting black intellectual achievement. In the 20th century, scholars began to look more critically at her work, examining the complex strategies she employed. They noticed the subtle subversions in her poetry, the ways she used Christian language to indict Christian hypocrisy, the moments where her carefully constructed neoclassical form cracked open to reveal rage, grief, and resistance. Poems that had been read as simple religious meditations were re-examined and found to contain coded critiques of slavery. Her apparent acceptance of Christianity was understood as a strategic deployment of the colonizer's ideology against itself. Her polite requests for freedom were recognized as demands disguised in the only language her audience would accept. Contemporary scholars like Henry Louis Gates, Jr. have argued that Phillis Wheatley essentially created African American literature. She was not just the first black person to publish a book in America, she was the first to demonstrate that Africans and their descendants could master Western literary forms, not through imitation but through innovation, adaptation, and subtle resistance. Every black writer who came after Phillis Wheatley walks a path she carved. Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, all of them owe a debt to the girl who proved that black people could write, could think, could create art that would survive centuries. Her influence extends beyond literature. Phillis Wheatley became a symbol in the broader struggle for black recognition and rights. When W.B. Du Bois wrote about double consciousness, the experience of seeing oneself through the eyes of a contemptuous society, he was describing the reality Phillis Wheatley lived daily. She had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. She had to prove what should never have required proof. She had to defend her humanity before judges who benefited from denying it. And she did so with grace, intelligence, and a strategic brilliance that we are still learning to fully appreciate. What would Phillis Wheatley have achieved if she had been born free? If she had been white? If she had been male? These questions are unanswerable, but they haunt her legacy. What poems did she write that were never published? What ideas did she develop that died with her? What might she have created if her final years had not been consumed by the struggle for basic survival? The lost second manuscript represents more than just unpublished poems. It represents the systematic destruction of black intellectual and artistic production. How many other Phillis Wheatleys existed, but left no trace because they never found a Susanna Wheatley to notice them? How many died on slave ships? How many were worked to death in fields? How many were brilliant children whose genius was never recognized, never cultivated, never given the chance to emerge? Phillis Wheatley's story is simultaneously exceptional and representative. She was extraordinary in her achievements, but the forces that constrained her, slavery, racism, sexism, poverty, were ordinary. They were the machinery of oppression that countless black people navigated daily. Consider the timeline. Phillis Wheatley was born around 1753. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that all men are created equal, was written in 1776, when Phillis was already a published author of international renown. The Constitution, which would count enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, was ratified in 1788, for years after her death. She lived through the American Revolution, a war fought supposedly for liberty and freedom from tyranny. She wrote poems celebrating that revolution. And yet, the freedom being fought for explicitly excluded her and millions like her. The intellectual achievement of Phillis Wheatley should have shattered the ideological foundations of slavery. It did not, because ideology is not primarily about facts, it is about power. The same men who signed the attestation confirming her authorship continued to benefit from an economic system built on the premise of black inferiority. Today, Phillis Wheatley is commemorated in various ways. There are schools named after her, statues erected in her honor, scholarly conferences dedicated to studying her work. The Boston Women's Heritage Trail includes a stop at the site of the Wheatley House. In 2002, Molefi Kitasani included her in his list of the 100 greatest African Americans. The Boston Women's Heritage Trail, established in the 1990s, includes documentation of Phillis Wheatley's life and significance. Asani's 100 Greatest African Americans was published in 2002 by Prometheus Books. Various schools across the United States bear her name, including Phillis Wheatley Community School in New Orleans and Phillis Wheatley Elementary School in Philadelphia. But commemoration is not justice. Recognition is not reparation. The question remains, what do we owe Phillis Wheatley? What does America owe the girl it enslaved, examined, and exploited? We owe her the truth. The truth that she was not an exception but a glimpse of what millions of enslaved Africans might have achieved if given opportunity. The truth that her story is not primarily one of white benevolence, but of black brilliance that could not be contained even by chains. We owe her critical engagement with her work, not hagiography. She made strategic choices in her writing, choices that some contemporary critics find too accommodating to white sensibilities. But these critiques must be tempered with understanding of her position. She wrote from within slavery, then from a precarious freedom that could be revoked at any moment. Her strategies were survival strategies as much as they were literary choices. Phillis Wheatley was not a saint. She was a human being navigating impossible circumstances with the tools available to her. Those tools included exceptional intelligence, classical education, religious faith, and a poet's command of language. She used all of them to survive, to create, and to challenge the system that constrained her. Her poetry itself remains her most enduring legacy. The 1773 collection, reprinted numerous times, continues to be studied, analyzed, and debated. Scholars examine her use of classical allusion, her engagement with Christian theology, her subtle critiques of slavery, and her complex relationship to her African heritage. Some have criticized her for not being more explicitly radical in her rejection of Christianity and embrace of African identity. But this criticism often comes from people who never faced her choices. She was trying to survive. She was trying to be heard. She was trying to create space for her own voice in a world that insisted she should have none. And she succeeded. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, she succeeded. She made the world hear her. She made it acknowledge her mind. She made it confront, however briefly and incompletely, the lie at the heart of slavery. Phillis Wheatley opened a door. It was a small door, opened at tremendous cost, and it closed quickly after her death. But the fact that it opened at all mattered. Lucy Terry Prince, who wrote poetry before Wheatley but never published, represents the countless voices that remained unheard. Jupiter Hammond, a contemporary of Wheatley's who also published poetry while enslaved, showed that she was not alone. But Phillis Wheatley was the first to achieve international recognition, the first to force a formal examination and attestation, the first to publish a full collection. Lucy Terry Prince's poem Bars Fight, 1746, is considered the oldest known work of literature by an African American, though it was not published until 1855. Jupiter Hammond published poems beginning in 1760, but never published a collection. These facts establish Wheatley's first status in the context of other early black writers. After her death, it would be decades before another black woman published a book of poetry. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper would do so in 1845, more than 60 years after Wheatley's death. The door Wheatley opened had closed, but the memory that it had once been open remained. That memory mattered. It became part of the arsenal of arguments against slavery and racism. It became evidence that could not be erased. It became a foundation that future generations would build upon. When the Harlem Renaissance exploded in the 1920s, bringing an unprecedented flourishing of black literary and artistic achievement, it was building on groundwork laid by Phillis Wheatley. When Gwendolyn Brooks became the first black person to win the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1950, she was walking a path Wheatley had begun to clear. Every time a black writer is questioned about whether they really wrote their work, they face the same skepticism Phillis Wheatley faced. Every time a black person's achievement is dismissed as an exception, they fight the same battle. The struggle Phillis Wheatley engaged in is not historical. It is ongoing. History is not past. It is present. The questions Phillis Wheatley forced America to confront about intelligence, humanity, creativity, and the meaning of freedom remain unanswered. The nation still struggles to recognize black genius without demanding proof. Still celebrates black achievement while tolerating black poverty. Still claims to value freedom while perpetuating injustice. Before America believed black people could think, a black girl made them prove they could recognize genius. But the deeper truth is this: Phillis Wheatley did not need America's belief. Her intelligence existed independently of their acknowledgement. Her poetry possessed value whether or not they certified it. The attestation signed by those 18 men in 1772 did not create Phillis Wheatley's genius. It merely documented their own limitations, their inability to see what should have been obvious, their need for formal procedures to confirm what her words already proved. Phillis Wheatley wrote because she was a writer. She thought because she was human. She created because creativity is not granted by permission. It emerges from the human need to make meaning from experience. She was kidnapped from Senegal. She survived the Middle Passage. She endured enslavement. She mastered a foreign language. She studied classical literature. She wrote poetry that would outlast her captors. She forced a nation to examine her, and in doing so, she examined them back. Her poems are her testimony. They testify to suffering and resilience, to faith and doubt, to the hunger for freedom and the pain of its denial. They testify to the African experience in America, not as passive victimhood, but as active resistance, creative survival, and persistent humanity. Phillis Wheatley's story is not a story of white benevolence discovering black potential. It is a story of black brilliance persisting despite white cruelty. It is a story of a mind so powerful that even slavery could not contain it. The final irony is that we remember her by the name of her captivity. Phillis, the name of a slave ship. Wheatley, the name of her enslavers. Her original name, her African name, the name given by parents who loved her, is lost. But her words remain. In those words, there are traces of who she might have been if the world had been different. There are glimpses of a girl who remembered her mother's morning ritual, who carried the memory of Africa even as she mastered the language of her captors. And in those words, there is legacy. Every black person who writes, who thinks, who creates, who refuses to be defined by others' limitations, they carry forward what Phillis Wheatley began. She was born in Senegal. She died in Boston. She lived approximately 31 years. And in those years, she changed the world by refusing to let the world define her. Before America believed black people could think, a black girl made them prove they could recognize genius. Her name was Phillis Wheatley, and she did not write poems to prove she was human. She wrote poems because she was. The power of Phillis Wheatley's legacy rests not merely in the fact that she wrote, but in what she wrote and how she wrote it. To truly understand her contribution to American literature and the African-American intellectual tradition, one must examine the poetry itself, its techniques, its themes, its subversions, and its brilliance. Wheatley worked primarily in the neoclassical style that dominated 18th-century English poetry. This was the age of Alexander Pope, whose work she studied intensively. The neoclassical aesthetic valued order, reason, restraint, balanced couplets, classical allusions, and moral instruction. It was formal, polished, and intellectually demanding. For a young African girl, recently arrived from a different linguistic and cultural tradition, to master this complex form in a second language represents an achievement that cannot be overstated. But Wheatley did more than master the form. She adapted it to her own purposes, using its conventions to smuggle in critique and resistance. Consider her use of the heroic couplet, Pope's signature form. In poem after poem, Wheatley demonstrates perfect command of iambic pentameter, creating lines that balance and respond to each other with elegant precision. But within these formally perfect structures, she encodes meanings that her white readers might miss or dismiss. In On Imagination, written around 1770, Wheatley celebrates the power of the creative mind. Imagination, who can sing thy force, or who describe the swiftness of thy course? Soaring through air to find the bright abode, th imperial palace of the thundering god. We on thy pinions can surpass the wind, and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star the mental optics rove, measure the skies, and range the realms above. On Imagination appears in the 1773 collection. The poem demonstrates Wheatley's engagement with Enlightenment ideas about reason and creativity, while also asserting her own claim to imaginative power. The poem appears to be a straightforward celebration of imagination as a divine gift. But there's a subtext here that becomes clear when we remember who is writing. Wheatley is asserting that imagination, the capacity for creative thought, for transcendence, for intellectual flight, belongs to her. She can soar through air, can surpass the wind, can range the realms above. This is a claim to full humanity, to intellectual equality, embedded in verse so formally perfect that it disarms criticism. Her elegies, which constitute a significant portion of her published work, follow a conventional 18th century pattern. They mourn the deceased, celebrate their virtues, and offer Christian consolation to the bereaved. But Wheatley's elegies also do something else. They demonstrate her connections, her learning, and her right to participate in the public sphere. When she wrote an elegy for a merchant's wife or a minister or a child, she was performing a social function typically reserved for educated white men. She was claiming authority to speak on matters of life, death, morality, and faith. Each elegy was an assertion. I belong in this conversation. My voice matters. My interpretation of these events has value. The elegy for George Whitefield, which brought her widespread fame, is particularly instructive. Whitefield was a controversial figure, an evangelical preacher whose emotional style and focus on individual conversion troubled many established clergy. He was also sympathetic to slavery, having argued that it could be made more humane rather than abolished. Yet he also preached that black people had souls that could be saved, which was more than many white Christians were willing to acknowledge. Wheatley's elegy for Whitefield navigates these complexities. She praises his preaching, celebrates his faith, and mourns his loss. But she also makes sure to foreground the one aspect of his theology that mattered most to her, his assertion of black spiritual equality. She writes, "Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Savior is his title due. Washed in the fountain of redeeming blood, you shall be sons and kings and priests to God." She's using Whitefield's own words and theology to make an argument. If Africans can be sons and kings and priests to God, then how can they be treated as property? The poem manages to be both a conventional elegy and a theological argument against the foundations of slavery. This is the genius of Phillis Wheatley's strategy. She worked within the forms and conventions her audience accepted, but she bent those forms to her own purposes. She used the master's tools, not to dismantle the master's house, that would have been impossible from her position, but to inscribe her presence within it, to leave marks that could not be erased. Her poem, To the University of Cambridge in New England, addresses Harvard students with remarkable boldness. She, an enslaved teenage girl, lectures privileged white male students on morality and the dangers of sin. Students, to you 'tis given to scan the heights above, to traverse the ethereal space, and mark the systems of revolving worlds. Still more, ye sons of science, ye receive the blissful news by messengers from heaven. How Jesus' blood for your redemption flows. See him with hands outstretched upon the cross. Immense compassion in his bosom glows. He hears revilers, nor resents their scorn. What matchless mercy in the Son of God. She continues with a warning. Improve your privileges while they stay, ye pupils, and each hour redeem, that bears, or good or bad report of you to heaven. Let sin, that baneful evil to the soul, by you be shunned, nor once remit your guard. Suppress the deadly serpent in its egg. Ye blooming plants of human race divine, an Ethiop tells you 'tis your greatest foe. Its transient sweetness turns to endless pain, and in immense perdition sinks the soul. To the University of Cambridge, in New England, appears in the 1773 collection. The poem directly addresses Harvard students, using the term Ethiop to identify herself as African while claiming moral authority to instruct them. The audacity of this poem is stunning. An Ethiop tells you, she identifies herself as African and then presumes to instruct these privileged students on their moral duties. She warns them against sin, urges them to redeem their time, and reminds them that all their privileges mean nothing without virtue. The poem works on multiple levels. On the surface, it's conventional Christian moral instruction. But underneath, it's a reversal of the expected power dynamic. She, the enslaved African girl, possesses moral authority. They, the privileged white students, are in danger of falling into sin. She knows something they need to learn. One of the most persistent questions in Wheatley's scholarship concerns her relationship to Africa and African identity. Some critics have accused her of rejecting her African heritage, pointing to poems that seem to embrace her enslavement as a path to Christianity. But a closer reading reveals a more complex negotiation. Wheatley was approximately 7 or 8 years old when kidnapped from Africa. She retained memories of her homeland, the morning ritual her mother performed, the landscape, the people. These memories surface in her work in ways both direct and subtle. In On Being Brought from Africa to America, the poem that has generated perhaps the most debate, Phillis Wheatley's story is not only about race and slavery, but also about gender. She was triply marginalized, black, enslaved, and female. Each of these identities brought specific constraints and challenges. 18th century women, even white women of privilege, faced severe restrictions on their intellectual and creative lives. They were discouraged from pursuing serious education, barred from universities, and expected to confine their interests to domestic matters. When women did right, they were often criticized for overstepping their proper sphere. For an enslaved African girl to claim the right to intellectual life, to education, to poetry, this was revolutionary on multiple levels. She was challenging not only racial hierarchies but also gender hierarchies. She was asserting that a black female mind deserved cultivation, deserved recognition, deserved permanence. The examination by the 18 men in Boston takes on additional significance when viewed through the lens of gender. Phillis Wheatley, a teenage girl, stood before a panel of powerful adult men and defended her intellectual authority. This was not merely a racial trial, but a gendered one. A girl claiming the right to speak authoritatively on theology, morality, and poetry, this threatened multiple social orders simultaneously. In her poetry, Wheatley carefully navigates gender expectations. She writes within acceptable female genres, elegies, religious meditations, occasional verse. She does not claim political authority directly. That would have been too transgressive. Instead, she claims moral and spiritual authority, which was more acceptable for women. But even within these constraints, she finds ways to assert herself. When she addresses Harvard students, lecturing them on morality, she's claiming authority that no woman of her time, black or white, should have possessed. When she corresponds with prominent men as an intellectual equal, she's performing a kind of gender transgression disguised as propriety. Her marriage to John Peters has been viewed through various lenses, often negative. Some accounts portray Peters as a failure who dragged Phillis down. But this interpretation deserves scrutiny. Peters was a free black man trying to make his way in a society designed to prevent black economic success. The fact that he struggled does not necessarily mean he was inadequate. It may simply mean the obstacles were insurmountable. Moreover, we should consider what marriage meant for Phillis. It was a choice, perhaps her first real choice as a free woman. She chose John Peters. She chose to build a life with him. That this life was marked by hardship reflects the reality of black life in post-revolutionary America, not necessarily a personal failure. Her experience of motherhood and the loss of 3 children adds another layer of tragedy to her story. We have almost no record of her own words about these losses, but we can imagine the grief. To bear children in poverty, to watch them die, to continue trying to write poetry while navigating this trauma, this requires a strength we can barely fathom. The last verified poem we have from her, Liberty and Peace, was written in 1784, the year she died. She was still writing, still trying to make sense of the world, still claiming her voice, even as poverty and illness closed in. Phillis Wheatley's gender has often been overlooked in discussions of her work, as if being black and enslaved were challenges enough. But her experience was shaped profoundly by being a woman in a world that devalued women's minds, a black woman in a world that denied black humanity, an enslaved woman in a world that treated enslaved people as property. These identities were not separate, but intersecting, compounding. When we celebrate Phillis Wheatley, we must remember all of who she was. Not just a black poet, not just an enslaved person who achieved freedom, but a black woman who claimed intellectual authority in a world designed to deny it to her on every possible level. More than 2 centuries after her death, what do we owe Phillis Wheatley? What does America owe her? What does the world owe her? We owe her honest engagement with her life and work. Not hagiography that turns her into a symbol divorced from her humanity. Not critique that judges her by standards she could never have met, but honest reckoning with what she achieved, what she endured, and what she represents. We owe her the acknowledgement that her achievement was not a gift from benevolent enslavers, but her own triumph against oppression. The Wheatleys did not create Phillis Wheatley's genius. They merely failed to completely suppress it. Her brilliance was her own, born of her own mind, cultivated by her own will. We owe her the understanding that her strategies were necessary and brilliant. She did not have the luxury of writing exactly what she wanted, exactly as she wanted. She wrote what would be published, what would be read, what would allow her to continue writing. Within those constraints, she embedded critique, resistance, and truth. This was not accommodation. This was survival and subversion combined. We owe her the recognition that she was not an exception, but a glimpse. She represents not the rare flowering of African genius, but the potential that existed in millions who never got the chance. For every Phillis Wheatley who somehow survived the Middle Passage, learned to read, and got published, there were countless others whose brilliance died unknown, uncultivated, unrecorded. We owe her the commitment to supporting black artists and intellectuals not just when they can prove their genius under examination, but as a matter of justice and investment. The fact that Phillis Wheatley died in poverty, while her book remained in print, is an indictment. Recognition without support is hollow. Celebration without material care is cruelty. We owe her the work of continuing to excavate and study her poetry. Each generation reads her differently, finds new meanings, understands her strategies more deeply. This ongoing scholarly attention is not just academic exercise. It's a way of keeping her voice alive, of ensuring that her words continue to speak. We owe her the truth about American history. Her story cannot be separated from the story of American slavery, American hypocrisy, American racism. When we teach American literature, we must teach her. When we teach the American Revolution, we must teach about the enslaved people who heard promises of liberty that did not include them. When we teach about American genius, we must teach about genius that was suppressed, constrained, and ultimately killed by the systems that should have nurtured it. We owe her memory that is active, not passive. Not just a name on a school or a statue in a park, but engagement with her work, teaching of her poetry, wrestling with her legacy. We must read her poems, debate their meanings, argue about her strategies, and continue the conversations she started. We owe her the commitment to changing the systems that killed her. Phillis Wheatley died at 31 because she was black, female, and poor in a society that devalued all three. More than 2 centuries later, black women still face disparities in health care, economic opportunity, and life expectancy. Honoring Phillis Wheatley means working to create a world where the next Phillis Wheatley doesn't die young in poverty, while her brilliance goes unsupported. Phillis Wheatley's life poses questions that America still cannot fully answer. If she was human and she was the...
Phillis Wheatley's life is a story that doesn't end the way we expect. She rose from unimaginable beginnings. A stolen child who became one of the most celebrated poets in the Atlantic world. She proved her intelligence in a society that denied her humanity. She wrote words that crossed oceans and shook minds. But in the end, she died in silence. No wealth, no recognition, no second chance to share the work she still carried inside her. And maybe that's the hardest truth to accept. Not that she suffered, but that the world benefited from her brilliance and then let her fade away. Talent can open doors, but it doesn't always keep them open. Recognition from society is often temporary, but purpose is not. Strength is not just rising, it's enduring when everything falls apart. History doesn't always reward the people who change it. She gave the world her voice, and the world answered with silence. If this story stayed with you, don't just scroll past it. Subscribe for more untold histories that deserve to be remembered. Like this video to keep stories like this alive. And in the comments, tell me, what part of Phillis Wheatley's story affected you the most? Because stories like hers should never be forgotten.